No Promises in the Wind, Chapter 10. We put Joey to bed, and when I leaned over him, he gave a long sigh of contentment and looked up at me. Then he went to sleep almost immediately. I sat close to the bed and watched him as he slept. It took me a little while to realize fully that he was there, that the long nightmare of anxiety and anguish was over. Lonnie dropped down in a chair facing me, and for a time he just sat there, staring ahead of him, as if he, too, were emerging from some bad dream. "It's been a night," he said finally, leaning his head back against the chair and closing his eyes. "Did you have trouble finding him, Lonnie?" "Not in finding him. The police had a list of the people who had taken the 8 children this afternoon. Joey was with a couple who appeared to be in good circumstances, and they didn't want to give him up. He was clean and fed and dressed in warm night clothes. They sent for a doctor. They'd done everything they could, and so resented me at first. The woman, Mrs. Arthur, cried and took on over him. At first I thought maybe they were right. Maybe I had no business moving him while he's so frail. But Joey's the one who settled things. He intended coming home with me and finding his brother. There were no ifs about it. He was weak, but he raised Cain when he thought I was going to leave without him." I went over to the stove and poured a cup of coffee for him. He nodded his thanks. "The doctor came and examined him. He said it was better for me to bring him home if he was going to fret. I couldn't help but feel sorry for the Arthurs. They'd only had him a few hours, but they were in love with him already." Lonnie sipped his coffee slowly. "Lord, this is good. They offered me food over there, but I couldn't eat. I was all shook to pieces." I looked at the little hand that lay outside the blanket. "Do you think he'll be all right, Lonnie?" "Oh, yes. The doctor says it's just a matter of food and rest and love for Joey. We shouldn't feed him much at a time, but he must have something every few hours. You and Janie'll have to watch over him for a few days. He'll be all right. The doctor thinks so, too." "I wish the folks knew," I said, more to myself than to Lonnie. "They do," he said. "I went out while they were getting Joey ready to come home and sent a wire to your folks and one to Pete Harris. I just said, 'Found Joey. Everything's okay. I hope your dad can sleep tonight.'" "I hope so, too," I said. A kind of gladness for Dad went through my mind. When he'd finished his coffee, Lonnie stood up and began unbuttoning his shirt. "I think I'll have to get to bed if I'm to work tomorrow, Josh. I'm beat. Can you watch over him tonight?" "Of course." I looked up at him. In the space of a few months he had helped us to a chance to take care of ourselves, and when we had failed at that, he had saved both our lives. I said, "You took a big load on your shoulders that day you stopped your truck and waited for us, Lonnie." He smiled just a little. "No regrets. Good night, Josh." He turned the lamp down now, closing the door behind him. For the first time in what seemed like an eternity, I was once again alone with Joey. I couldn't bear to go to bed. I had to sit there in the dim light and look at Joey while he slept. Somehow I was afraid to go to sleep. I had to stay awake and be sure that the miracle of finding him was real. He woke up after an hour or so, and I heated some milk and brought it to him. I sat on the bed at his back so he could lean against me while he sat up, and he drank the milk eagerly, and when he was through, lifted his hand and reached for mine. "I found you, didn't I?" he said. I held his hand tightly in mine. It was a terribly thin little hand, so thin that it made a shudder run over me when I realized the narrow margin by which I'd been allowed to have him with me again. I said, "Can you tell me what happened, Joey, just a little before you go back to sleep?" "Yes." He hesitated, and his face showed the pain of remembering that night when we quarreled. "I went back to the shed," he said finally. "I stayed there all night, and I waited and waited the next day. I thought sure you'd come back, but when you didn't, I thought I'd better try to get home." He was silent for a long time. "If it tires you, Joey, don't talk. You can tell me tomorrow." "No, I'm just trying to get words to tell you. I started to hitchhike home, but I had such a feeling that I was doing the wrong thing. I kept thinking you needed me. So I came back to Omaha. I thought you'd be here." Why didn't you call Lonnie when you got here, Joey?" It was awful. I couldn't remember his last name. I think we mentioned it just once down at the carnival. I tried and tried to remember, but I couldn't. I was just lost in Omaha looking for a man named Lonnie. I couldn't talk much. "You mustn't get tired," I told him. "Better go to sleep now." He shook his head. "I've got to tell you one thing, Josh. I didn't know that you were sick with fever that night. Lonnie told me as we were coming home. He told me that you were sick and scared, that you didn't know what you were doing. There's never any real excuse for being as mean as I was, Joey, but it's true that I was awfully sick and scared. I know you were. Like Dad, I guess, the night he turned on you. He burrowed down under the covers and was asleep almost as soon as the words were spoken, but I sat there, looking straight ahead into the shadows for a long time. The picture was painful, but there it was, clear and sharp before me. Suddenly, for the first time that winter, I wanted to go home. Without warning, a wave of such homesickness as I'd never felt before came over me. I could think of nothing but Dad, of sleepless nights for him like the ones I had known, of remorse and anguish as bitter for him as mine had been for me. I'd remembered the black looks and the mean, cruel words all winter, remembering them in great detail to help maintain the dislike for him which I thought would never change. But at Joey's words there in the darkness I felt only pity, and a sense of having been subjected to the same hell Dad had known. I hoped I wouldn't undergo a change of feeling the next morning, that I felt better and more mature, and I felt a compassion that was altogether new to me. I tried being matter of fact with myself. No point in kidding myself that Dad and I would ever be able to live together without running into problems. We were too much alike. I remembered a few times when he had apologized to Mom for a show of impatience toward her on his part. "It's the Grondowski in me, Mary," he would tell her, blaming the father he resented for his own weaknesses. I had often tended to write off my own weaknesses as being inherited from Dad. It occurred to me as I lay there beside Joey in the silent room that both Stefan and Josh Grondowski should stop blaming their fathers and work on a little self-discipline and understanding themselves. I wondered if someday I might talk to Dad about the weaknesses we shared. I couldn't settle down to sleep. The thoughts kept whirling around in my head. It seemed incredible to me that the wish to go home should all at once be so strong inside me. How easy it would have been to catch rides back to Chicago when we were healthy. Now Joey would not be strong for many weeks, and my cough was still with me, my legs too weak for more than walking around the rooms of Lonnie's house. Besides that, there was a great debt which we owed Lonnie. Somehow I had to get well and find a job so that I could repay him before we left. That was a matter of great importance to me. One thing to Stefan Grandowski's credit was the fact that he had taught his sons to be honest about their debts. That much I believed I would have admitted even when my anger against him was bitterest. The prospect of repaying a debt, however, was very dim. We were penniless, neither of us well enough to take care of ourselves. If I can get rid of this cough and gain some strength, maybe Lonnie can find work for me here in Omaha. Or maybe I can take Joey back to Chicago and then set out for the carnival when Pete gets it going again. Maybe, with summer coming on, the maybes cluttered up my brain and made my temples throb. At 2 o'clock, Joey awoke, and I fed him some soup that had kept warm on the back of the stove. At 6, I was up making a hot cereal for him, but Grandma came over and made me go back to bed while she finished the cooking, and with many little murmurs of sympathy, gave Joey his breakfast. Joey began to recuperate immediately. With each meal, we could see new brightness come into his face, new light in his eyes. Janie became his special nurse, and I sometimes caught a twinkle in my young brother's eyes, a twinkle that seemed to crow over me as Janie hovered over him, feeding him, reading to him, pampering him as much as he would allow. Mrs. Arthur, the woman who, with her husband, had taken Joey into their home the night Lonnie found him, came to visit him on his third day with us. She was an attractive woman, nicely dressed and smelling faintly of a perfume that was like spring flowers. She exclaimed over Joey and cried a little as she sat beside him. Finally she turned to speak to me as I stood at the head of his bed. "You're the brother he was looking for? You or Josh?" she asked. "Yes. I could have kept Joey for a while. I could have had the joy of nursing him back to health if he hadn't been so anxious to see his brother." She looked at me almost resentfully, although she smiled. "We're very grateful to you, ma'am. I can't ever thank you enough for what you did for Joey that night." Her face relaxed somewhat. "Mr. Bromer told us a great deal of what you boys have lived through this winter. He mentioned that you played the piano quite well." I enjoy playing," I answered. "How long have you studied?" "My mother gave me lessons until a couple of years ago when we had to sell our piano. Since then, I've learned on my own. Oh, she said, and looked down at her gloved hands as if she took little stock in the kind of lessons one learns from his own mother. Then Joey spoke up. If you'd hear my brother play, you'd understand, Mrs. Arthur. He's really top notch. She smiled down at him. Then I'd like to hear him play, Joey. Maybe when you're well, you and your brother and Mr. Bromer's niece can come to my house and we'll hear Josh play. Would you like that? He nodded, delighted. I didn't feel so enthusiastic myself. I had a feeling that she was a woman who would have suffered if music familiar to her was subjected to a little improvisation, a beat that was a little different, but I thanked her. Yes, I'd like to play for you, I said, but I didn't think it likely that I ever would. She left books and games for Joey, some special things to eat, and some articles of clothing, which she said had once belonged to her own children, but which looked suspiciously new. She also brought his old jacket, the $20 overshoes, and the knife with Pete Harris's initials in the handle. And, carefully wrapped as if she knew it was precious, was Howie's banjo in a large cardboard box. During the next few days, when Joey and I were alone, I got out pen and paper and began the letters I needed to write. I wrote home, first of all. In the beginning, I wrote, Dear Mom, and then after a long time, I added, and Dad. I told him how Joey had been found, how fast he was recuperating, how comfortable and safe we were with Lonnie. I didn't say that I'd been homesick, that I wanted to bring Joey home soon. I couldn't quite say that. But I felt that my letter would certainly reassure them. I told them a little about Janie, and I sent our love to Kitty. After that, I wrote to Edward C., and then to Emily. I didn't know whether she was Mrs. Pete Harris or not. I simply directed the letter to Emily in care of Pete Harris. She'd asked me to write to her, and I wondered what I would ever have to say to her. I found that it wasn't hard. I used up page after page in telling her the whole story, in sharing my anxiety and then my joy with her. We were a happy family during those last weeks of March, so happy that I almost forgot the loneliness for home that I'd felt earlier. The attention of all of us was centered upon Joey, and our common concern over him made us a tightly drawn little group. Lonnie was especially cheerful these days. He would come home bringing treats for supper. Oysters, because they were Grandma's favorite food. Ice cream, because that was Joey's. One night, when I'd lost all traces of my cough, he took Janie and me to a movie, leaving Grandma and Joey at home with a big bowl of popcorn he'd fixed for them. He spoke of us as his 3 kids. He would ask Janie to read aloud in the evening, and we would sit around the table listening, Lonnie on the old couch resting his arm around Joey's shoulders. I noticed Grandma watching him on one such night as she stood at her ironing board. There were tears in her eyes. As I grew stronger, I began to think more and more about getting a job. The bread of charity choked me a little, now and then. I felt that the proudest moment of my life would come when I could begin to repay Lonnie for what he'd done for us, and when all was repaid, then, perhaps, home. Perhaps. I wasn't quite sure, but I thought that home was what I wanted. Lonnie recognized my restlessness and need for work. Sure, sure, Josh, I'll keep my eyes open. Something might turn up. We've got to be careful, though. You've lost 20 pounds this winter. I can't let you take on too much until you're husky again. And then one evening, Mrs. Arthur appeared again. She asked Lonnie if she might pick the 3 of us up and take us to her house for lunch the next day. Lonnie smiled at her. Are you sure you want Josh and Janie or just this lady killer here? She asked, indicating Joey. She was a pleasant woman, ready to laugh. She said, Joey is my first love, yes, but I want the others too. I want to hear Josh play, just to see if what his little brother says about him is true. Lonnie loaned me a decent shirt, and I carefully pressed the old trousers Pete Harris had given me. Joey was fairly well supplied with the clothing Mrs. Arthur had bought for him earlier. Janie, of course, had no problem. She wore her best blue cotton dress and tied her hair back with a band of blue velvet. Her costume brought praise from the 3 male members of her family, a praise that deepened the color in her cheeks, overcoming the freckles and making her very pretty. Mrs. Arthur picked us up at 11 o'clock. She had a friendly way about her that put us at ease as we drove along and stopped finally at a house in a neighborhood obviously much wealthier than the one in which Lonnie lived. The Arthur home seemed magnificent to us, but the great piano in an alcove off the living room was the one point of interest as far as I was concerned. I walked toward it, forgetting the other 3, unaware at first that they stood watching me, smiling at my fascination with the beautiful instrument. "We will leave you and the piano alone for a while, Josh," Mrs. Arthur said, coming over to my side. "You may want to get your hands accustomed to the keyboard again before you play for me. Go ahead, it's all yours for the next hour before we eat." It was the finest instrument I'd ever touched, and the most beautiful resonant tones that responded to my fingers thrilled me so much that I forgot everything except my own delight. I roamed the keyboard for a time, softly at first, and then with mounting excitement. I had improvised upon a love theme for Emily down in the carnival grounds, but as I sat at Mrs. Arthur's piano, my improvisations covered a wider scope. It was as if a long story passed before my eyes and became music somewhere inside my brain. I forgot where I was. I forgot that someone might be listening, and I played as I watched Howie's body carried down a long track. I played as I remembered a boy standing humiliated before a pretty girl who told him she was sorry he must beg. I played as I relived the fear of cold and hunger, the anguish of losing Joey, and finally, the surge of gratitude that the world had righted itself for me had restored my confidence. When I was through, I realized that Mrs. Arthur and Janie and Joey were standing near me. Janie's eyes were large and grave when I looked up at her. "I don't know you, Josh," she said just above a whisper. Mrs. Arthur stood there looking at me. I couldn't tell what she was thinking. And finally, she said, "You were improvising, weren't you?" "Yes," I said. I thought she probably didn't like it. "And you've only had lessons with your mother?" "Well, yes, she's a fine teacher, though." "I believe you, Josh." She looked at me thoughtfully. "You'd like a job playing somewhere, wouldn't you?" "I don't think you can imagine how much I want a job like that." "Well," she looked down at Joey's face, which was full of pride for me. "We'll have to see, Joey. We'll have to see if we can't find a job of some sort for your brother." I don't remember much about the lunch. It was delicious, whatever it was, and served on thin china that Janie would later describe to Grandma in detail. Mrs. Arthur was gay and pleasant. Joey and Janie were at ease and chatted with her all during the meal. I alone was silent. It seemed as if I were in a dream, and I only came out of it when the others teased me. Mrs. Arthur smiled at me. "It's a promise. Josh, I'll find someone who will pay for music like yours." That day marked the point when the dream Howie and I had shared began to take form. Within a week, Mrs. Arthur came over to see me. "I've talked to a lot of people, Josh. Last night my husband and I talked to the manager of a very fine restaurant here. The manager, Mr. Erickson, is a friend of my husband's, and we persuaded him it would be a good idea to feature music from 6 till midnight, creating a job for a boy and doing a good thing for himself, too. I told him quite a lot about you, how much I liked hearing your music, and since he respects my knowledge of music, he wants to hear you play tomorrow afternoon. I'll drive you over." It was as if a long nightmare had given way to a fairy tale. Mr. Erickson liked my playing. The salary, in comparison to the $5 a week which I had received at the carnival, seemed princely to me. Mrs. Arthur took me to a shop and fitted me with an appropriate suit and shoes. She wanted to give them to me, but I jotted down the cost and prepared to repay her as soon as I had money. Begging had left its scars, scars that hurt again even at the kindliest of gifts. My work at the restaurant gave me a great deal of satisfaction. There was no silly clowning to be carried out as had been necessary to do the job down at the carnival. I was a well-dressed, poised young man who played as I wanted to play, who responded courteously to requests. One point bothered me at first, but out of necessity I quickly pushed it to the back of my mind. Mr. Erickson had placed a printed page titled "Our Wild Boy of the Road" inside the menu covers. There the diners could read about Joey and me, about the fact that we left home because our family didn't have enough to eat. There was a detailed account of the begging, of the freezing and starving we'd endured. It shamed me at first. Our troubles were a drawing card, like poor Ellsworth's flippers that had grown instead of arms, like Madame Olympia's mountain of flesh, like Edward C. Kensington's dwarfism and the pitiful hump on his back. But it was not a time for sensitivity. A job was so precious a thing, so much a gift right out of heaven that I had no right to protest. I didn't tell Joey about it, though, nor Janie, but one night I told Lonnie. His lips tightened and his eyes looked angry for a moment, but he didn't say anything. It wasn't long until Mr. Erickson decided to feature Joey with me. There had been an account in the papers, as well as on the radio, of the boy who looked like a half-famished angel clasping a banjo in lieu of a harp. People wanted to see the younger wild boy, and so, After I'd worked with him for hours, helping him to accompany me when I played some old or popular ballads, Joey stood beside me on the platform, singing and playing ringing chords on Howie's old banjo. He was a great attraction. His fragile appearance and beauty, as well as a natural gift for comedy, made him an immediate hit. Diners didn't care if he stumbled over the chords occasionally. There'd be a little flurry of laughter when his voice suddenly wandered off key. Then, when he grinned widely and got himself straightened out with some help from me, he'd receive a burst of laughing applause. Joey accepted his success as casually as he accepted the fact that most people loved him at first sight. It was just a fact of life to him, nothing to get excited about. But to me, our success was so marvelous a thing that I couldn't get used to it. Several times I woke up in the night, and for a second I thought that I was somewhere out in the fields or in the train depot of some lonely little town, and that I'd had a dream of something too wonderful to be true. The wonder eased that loneliness I'd felt for home the night of Joey's return. Home kept receding from my mind as the nights passed. Gay, pleasant nights when I played for well-dressed, happy people who could afford to dine in beautiful restaurants. And then at the end of the week there was a check. Money to pay our debts, money to make us feel confident and secure. We sent money home from time to time, and we gave almost all the rest of it to Lonnie. He accepted it without comment, but I had the feeling he was not using it to help with household expenses. We owe you this money, Lonnie. It's yours. We don't want to be leeches on you. Lonnie was almost curt with me. People don't want to be paid for some things. Sure, I'll keep a little money for medicines and extra expenses. I do that because I like the way you boys fight to keep your self-respect in money matters. But don't ask me to take money for the food you've eaten or the bed you slept in. You know about my boy. You must know how I feel about you and Joey. He folded and refolded the bills I've given him. You boys will need this when you go back to Chicago, he added. I didn't like for him to mention going back to Chicago. It brought a strangely mixed feeling of homesickness, of guilt and resentment that Joey and I should be asked to give up something better than our best hopes, and go back to something once bitter and still unsure. The mail brought word from Emily one day, an envelope addressed in a high, delicate script that looked as if every letter had been drawn painstakingly. The writing looked like Emily, I thought, and I opened the envelope carefully so that no part of my name as she had written it would be destroyed. She told me of the relief and joy of Pete, of Edward C., of her boys and herself when they heard that Joey was safe and that I was recovering from pneumonia. She said, "We had you boys with us for only a few weeks, but you made your way into our affections. We will never forget you. Never stop wishing the very best of good fortune for both of you." And she sent messages from Peter and Edward C. She told me a little of how Peter was rebuilding his carnival, which he would bring farther north in the summer. There was only one mention of her marriage. My boys are happy to have a father once again, and Pete is a kind and understanding father. That was all. I wondered if she were happy too. I hoped so. Then, like Lonnie, she talked about my going home. "I beg you, Josh, to take your little brother home, to make peace with your father and to gladden your mother's heart. Parents are sometimes very wrong, I know that well enough. But unless they are really evil, they agonize over their mistakes. Your parents are not evil, Josh. They couldn't have produced two beautiful boys like you and Joey if they were. I beg you again, please go home." I played at the restaurant 6 nights a week, and because I had to practice many hours of the day, I had very little opportunity to see Janie. But on my one night off, we'd take long walks talking of one thing and another, sometimes coming home to sit together with our hands clasped, as she and Lonnie's boy used to do. Spring was late that year, but week by week the days grew warmer, the air gentler. One evening as Janie and I walked together, a misty rain enveloped us, hardly enough to make us bother with an umbrella, but enough to make little wisps of her hair curl against Janie's cheeks, to make her skin glow with the tiny drops of mist that moistened it. "You're my girl, aren't you, Janie?" I asked her. "Yes," she said. "I've been your girl ever since that afternoon when you told me that I didn't need to wear earrings like Emily. And you pressed your cheek against my hand. I've loved you ever since then, Janie. I always will, as long as I live." She didn't answer for a while. Then she stopped and faced me as we reached a little clump of trees in the dark. "Lonnie has talked to me, Josh. He thinks that you and Joey should go home to your mother and dad. He told me that I mustn't try to keep you here because I care so much for you. And I won't. I'll be terribly lonely when you and Joey are gone, but we must listen to Lonnie. He's always known what was best for me. He knew what was best for you when you were down and out, and he must know what's best now that things were better. She was right, and I knew it. But all kinds of feelings churned inside me as I thought about leaving her. I don't know what to do. Janie, I'm pulled in all directions. I can't quite figure out what's right. She lifted her arms and then placed her hands on my shoulders. I drew her to me. I'll come back to you, Janie, I whispered. I'll come back, you'll see. Just as soon as I make things right with my parents, I'll come back. She said, yes, of course, Josh. At least I hope so. I could see that she didn't quite accept my promise. Janie had lost her parents, a cousin she adored, an aunt who had been almost like a second mother to her. She didn't really believe that the people she loved ever came back. The next days were full of inner turmoil and uncertainty for me. My love for Janie was very real and tender. I knew, though, that we were very young, and that a thing called marriage, which people in love always thought about, was something so far in the future as to be unreal. But that made our love no less true. I wanted to strike out at anyone who dared to say we were too young to understand love. Lonnie came and stood beside me one evening as I stood staring at nothing from the window. He was silent, as if waiting for me to speak. You know that Janie and I love one another, don't you? Yes, I know, he answered. Don't call it puppy love, Lonnie. No, I'm not one to downgrade love at any age. What I wanted to say to you is this. Your going home is not the most final thing in the world. You've been successful on a job out here. You've made friends who will help you to find a job if you don't find one in Chicago. And as for Janie, this feeling between you and her could last as long as you live. It could change, too. You've got to face that. But let's suppose it lasts. You'll always be welcome in my home, even if you only come to see Janie. He smiled at me, and I felt comforted. My bitter winter had ended in good fortune. It gave me hope for the years ahead. That night, I played for the diners at Mr. Erickson's restaurant with a lighter heart and with a greater feeling of optimism. Mr. Erickson asked me to help Joey increase his repertoire of appealing songs, and in thinking about the list which we might choose from, I remembered Dad's old Polish song, Galru Sinik Zezal, which was the one that came back to me one awful night when I believed I was going to die. I think that as a little boy I had been so impressed by the expression on Dad's face when he taught me the words. It's a song about the yearning for home, he had told me, and I had interpreted that as meaning a yearning for his native country. But now I knew that it might be a yearning for the mountains of Poland, or the beaches of Spain, or the dreariness of Chicago's West Side. For several mornings, Joey and I rehearsed together while the restaurant was still closed. I taught him the Polish words, and he learned to accompany me softly and with tenderness on Howie's banjo. It's beautiful, isn't it, Josh? He said. I think so. I've loved it ever since I was a little boy. Joey took a deep breath. It hurts, though. It makes me want to see Mom and Dad. He ran his fingers over the strings of the banjo, and the chords sounded lonely, just as they'd sounded that night on the freight train when Howie had strummed his banjo for a minute and then laid it aside. You want to go home, don't you, Joey? I asked after a minute. He nodded, without looking up at me. If you do, he said. All right, we'll go home. Everyone advises it, all the people who care about us. I think perhaps they're right. It's time we headed for home. I talked to Mr. Erickson that afternoon. I told him how we felt and what we had to do. He was a kind man. He gave me a letter of recommendation and suggested places in Chicago where I might present it. We shook hands, and I hoped I had made him realize how much I appreciated what he had done for us. The authors invited Lonnie and Janie and Grandma to have dinner with them that night at the restaurant. When the audience asked Joey and me for an encore, I looked down into their faces and did what I'd never done before. I made an announcement. Joey and I will sing you a Polish song tonight, a song that tells about a longing for home. You people here in Omaha have been kind to us and we'll never forget you. But now we have to go. The wild boys of the road have been gone a long time, and tonight they're homesick. Then Joey and I sang Dad's song, and people applauded as they never had before.